Thanks for watching Endgame Economics. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe. It's completely free for you, and it helps us continue making more videos like this.
All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the towering myth versus the startling reality of the World Health Organization. You know, if you just read the headlines or scroll through social media, you might actually think of the WHO as this massive global monolith, like some all-powerful medical authority just dictating terms to the entire planet. But we're going to look past that. We're looking at the actual data, the hard numbers, and the intricate geopolitical wiring of this organization to see how it truly operates under the hood. And what's truly fascinating here is the sweeping, incredibly ambitious mandate the WHO gave itself way back when it was founded in 1948. Born in the ashes of World War II and a devastating global flu pandemic, the international community was ready to build something radical. They drafted a constitution flat out stating that health is a fundamental right, not just a privilege for folks with competent governments, but a right for every single human being. On paper, it sounds like the WHO is designed to perfectly direct and coordinate the entire world. But here is the stark reality. $6.8 billion. That number was the WHO's entire base program budget to coordinate global health for 192 countries over a 2-year period, specifically the 2024 to 2025 biennium. Think about that. With that amount of money, they are expected to monitor disease surveillance, handle pandemic preparedness, secure essential medicines, and manage emergency responses across the entire globe. So the crucial takeaway here is this massive mismatch. The supposed global authority on international health literally runs on less money than a single U.S. hospital. Just think about that for a second. New York Presbyterian pulls in over $11 billion in a single year. The WHO, they get a little over half of that to last them 2 whole years for the entire planet. Once you really grasp this financial reality, well, everything else about how the WHO behaves starts to make perfect sense. To truly understand how this institution functions, we've got a lot of ground to cover. We're going to look at the global health myth, dissect their federated bureaucracy, follow the money, review some of their greatest hits and misses, break down the recent pandemic agreement, and finally, dive into their current existential crisis. Let's kick things off with part 1, the global health myth. Public perception so often assumes the WHO has this massive army of doctors, just ready to deploy anywhere with infinite resources. But the reality on the ground is vastly different. As of 2026, while they're actively trying to manage a deadly, multi-country Andes virus outbreak in South America, a severe respiratory disease emergency, the WHO is reeling from the official withdrawal of both the United States and Argentina. That single event triggered a wildly slashed budget of just $4.2 billion, leading to the firing of nearly 3,000 staff members. Literally, they are fighting a global fire with a severely leaking hose. Which leads us directly to part 2, a federated bureaucracy. You see, most international organizations have a boss at headquarters who just issues commands top-down. But the WHO doesn't actually work that way. Power isn't just centralized in Geneva. The world is sliced up into 6 semi-autonomous regions. And here's the kicker. Regional directors are elected locally by the countries in their specific region. They aren't appointed by the Director General in Geneva. They hold massive autonomy. Now, this is both their secret superpower, because it allows for localized, context-specific health responses, and a total recipe for coordination chaos when headquarters and regional offices inevitably disagree during a crisis. At the very top, the WHO is controlled by its 192 member states at the annual World Health Assembly. Every single member state gets exactly 1 vote, whether you're a tiny island nation or a massive global superpower. Yet notable absences really reveal the intense geopolitical constraints baked right into this bureaucracy. Take Taiwan, for example. Because of a 1971 UN resolution recognizing Beijing, 23 million Taiwanese people have absolutely no formal voice in the organization, and that's a political reality that had massive global implications during the early days of COVID-19. All right, part 3, following the money. Once you see exactly how they're funded, I promise you, all the weird quirks make sense. The WHO basically has 2 funding streams: assessed contributions, which are the mandatory membership dues, and voluntary contributions. Now, the vast majority of the WHO's budget, a whopping 83%, comes from voluntary contributions. But here is the massive catch. Almost 88% of those voluntary funds are what they call specified. That means the donor dictates exactly what disease or region the money goes to. So at the end of the day, the WHO only has meaningful control over roughly a quarter of its own budget. And this brings us to what scholars often call the Gates problem. When we look specifically at philanthropic donations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation accounts for a staggering 88% of that slice. This creates a really unique reality where a single private foundation holds more discretionary funding power over the global health agenda than almost any sovereign country on Earth. Now, it's not necessarily some grand conspiracy, it's honestly just what happens when member states refuse to raise their mandatory dues, leaving this massive vacuum that private billionaires are more than willing to fill.
Moving right along to Part 4. Greatest hits and misses.
Despite all these structural flaws we just talked about, they have actually pulled off the impossible in the past. For just $300 million, the WHO achieved a genuine miracle of cooperative bureaucracy, the total eradication of smallpox. We're talking about a disease that killed an estimated 300 million people in the 20th century alone. By 1980, they officially declared the world free of the disease, and that has saved the global economy an estimated $1 billion every single year since. It is an absolutely stunning return on investment that proves exactly why this organization is fundamentally essential.
But on the flip side, that same decentralized structure and heavy reliance on member state reporting has led to catastrophic failures. Back during the 2014 Ebola outbreak, there was a lethal 5-month delay before they declared an emergency in West Africa. And then in 2020 with COVID-19, geopolitical constraints meant early warning signals from Taiwan were completely missed, and the WHO was forced to just wait on delayed reporting from China regarding human-to-human transmission. The WHO's defense is always that they have zero inspection authority and have to trust their member states, but as we saw, the consequences of that were devastating.
Now let's look at Part 5, the Pandemic Agreement. To try and address those exact past failures, member states spent years drafting this new agreement to fix the global health architecture. At the heart of it is a system called PABS, or Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing. The basic idea is simple. Countries rapidly share dangerous pathogen data, and in return, pharmaceutical manufacturers must provide around 20% of the resulting vaccines or treatments directly to the WHO. This system is aiming to prevent the gross vaccine hoarding we saw in 2020, where rich countries essentially got everything first. However, as you might guess, it has sparked intense debate over intellectual property rights and manufacturing leverage among wealthier nations.
But this specific clause right here cuts straight through all the online noise. If you spent any time on the internet lately, you've definitely seen claims that this treaty gives the WHO the power to, lock you in your house. But the explicit legal text guarantees the exact opposite. It literally says the WHO absolutely cannot mandate lockdowns, travel bans, or forced vaccinations. The treaty explicitly affirms national sovereignty. As an organization, they simply don't have the legal or physical power to override a country's domestic laws.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, an existential crisis.
Because, let's be real, treaties only matter if the institution actually survives to enforce them, bringing us to the unprecedented geopolitical earthquake of 2026. The WHO is currently fighting for its life on the global stage. Director General Tedros is attempting to steer this ship while navigating some profound political knife fights involving major world powers. He's facing intense scrutiny over his complex relationship with China and Taiwan, major pushback from massive financial donors, and even conflict with his own home country of Ethiopia, where the federal government actively opposed him due to his background with the Tigray region. It's just a remarkably volatile environment for a global health leader.
But honestly, nothing compares to this dizzying timeline, which culminated in January 2026 with the official exit of the United States. Historically, the U.S. provided roughly $1 in every $5 the WHO ever spent. This timeline, from the initial pause under Trump in 2020 to a reversal by Biden in 2021, and finally an executive order withdrawal completed in 2026, has completely stripped the WHO of its biggest historical donor, and it left behind a massive funding gap and hundreds of millions in unpaid bills.
As we look ahead, the organization is undeniably flawed. It's chronically underfunded, and it's heavily politically constrained. Yet, as the smallpox eradication proves, it remains practically essential. We simply do not have a backup organization standing by to manage global disease. This leaves us with one monumental question. Who fills the vacuum left by the US, and what exactly does the next global pandemic response look like without them at the table? It's a sobering reality we're all going to have to watch unfold very closely.